My stepmother evicted me from my childhood house after my father died and stole his entire estate meant for me. I took back everything. My dad married Diane when I was 16, 2 years after my mom died in a car accident. Diane had 2 kids from her previous marriage, Justin, who was 14, and Bailey, who was 12. At first, Diane seemed nice enough, always saying how she wasn't trying to replace my mom and just wanted us all to be a family. My dad was lonely and seemed happy, so I tried to be supportive even though something felt off about how fast she moved into our house. Dad owned a construction company that he'd built from nothing, and we lived in a nice house he'd designed himself. He always told me the business and house would be mine one day since I'd been working with him every summer since I was 12 learning the trade. Diane acted supportive of this, saying it was sweet how close we were and how she respected our father-daughter bond. Her kids were nice enough but spoiled, always asking my dad for money for new games or clothes, which he gave them because he wanted them to like him. Everything changed when my dad got diagnosed with liver disease when I was 20. The doctor said he had maybe 2 years. Diane immediately became super protective, saying I was stressing him out by visiting too much. She started handling all his medications and appointments, saying she had more flexible time since she didn't work. My dad got weaker fast, and Diane convinced him to let her handle the business finances so he could focus on his health. She brought in her brother to help run the construction company, saying it was temporary. One day when Diane was out, my dad called me over. He could barely talk, but he grabbed my hand and said he'd taken care of everything, that I'd be okay when he was gone. He passed away 3 days later. At the funeral, Diane cried harder than anyone while her kids just played on their phones. After the service, she told me we'd talk about the estate once things settled down. A week later, Diane called me over to discuss my dad's will. She had this lawyer with her who I'd never seen before. The will left everything to Diane. The house, the business, his investments, all of it. I said that couldn't be right. My dad promised me everything. Diane acted sad and said my dad must have been confused near the end because of his medication. The will was dated 2 weeks before he died, when he could barely stay awake. I asked to see the signature and it looked nothing like my dad's handwriting. The lawyer said it was normal for signatures to change when someone was sick. Diane gave me $5,000 in cash and said it was all she could spare, but I could keep my childhood bedroom furniture. She actually evicted me from my childhood home within a month. I moved in with my cousin Tanya and started investigating. Found out the lawyer was Diane's cousin Robert, who'd lost his license in another state for forging documents. He was practicing illegally here. I also tracked down my dad's real lawyer, who said my dad had a will leaving everything to me that he'd updated 3 months before he died. When he tried to contact Diane about it, she said there was a newer will. I contacted my dad's nurse from the hospital, who remembered Diane bringing papers for my dad to sign when he was heavily medicated. She thought it was insurance forms. The nurse said my dad couldn't even hold a pen and Diane had to guide his hand. That's when I started my plan. First, I went to Justin and Bailey acting all sisterly. Told them I wanted to stay close even though their mom got everything. Started taking them to movies, buying them food, acting like the cool older sister. They started telling me everything, like how their mom was already planning to sell the construction company to some developer who'd tear down my dad's house to build condos. She was going to move them all to California with the money. Justin mentioned their mom had been moving money to accounts in their names to avoid taxes. She'd already transferred hundreds of thousands. Bailey showed me documents their mom kept in her room about the property sale. I took pictures of everything when they weren't looking. Then I visited Robert, the fake lawyer, at his office. Told him I knew he was practicing without a license and forged my dad's will. I said I'd go to the police unless he helped me. He tried to deny it, but I showed him the evidence I'd gathered. He broke down and admitted Diane paid him $20,000 to create the fake will. I pulled my phone out right there in his office and hit record. Robert looked at the phone and then back at me, his face going pale. I told him to start from the beginning and tell me everything about how Diane paid him to forge my dad's will. He sat there for a few seconds just staring at his desk, and then he started talking. He said Diane approached him about 2 months before my dad died, asking if he could help her with some legal paperwork. She knew he'd lost his license in another state for document issues, and she said she needed someone who understood how to handle delicate situations. Robert described how Diane paid him $10,000 up front and promised another $10,000 once everything was done. She brought him copies of my dad's real signature from old checks and business documents, telling him to practice until he could make it look natural. He tried 3 different times to forge the signature on the fake will, and the first 2 looked too shaky. The third attempt was close enough that Diane said it would work as long as nobody looked too carefully. Robert's hands were shaking while he talked, and he kept wiping sweat off his forehead with a tissue. He explained how Diane timed everything for when my dad was heavily medicated and barely aware of what was happening around him. She told Robert the exact day to date the will, so it would be recent enough to override my dad's real one, but not so recent that people would question whether my dad was capable of signing anything. I asked him about the day Diane brought the papers to the hospital, and he said she called him right after to confirm my dad had put some kind of mark on the page. Robert admitted he knew it wasn't really my dad's signature, just Diane guiding his hand across the paper while he was too weak to resist. The whole confession took about 20 minutes, and I made sure my phone captured every single word. I left Robert's office and drove straight to Cameron Roberts' law firm downtown. Cameron was my dad's real lawyer, the one who'd helped him with the business and the house and everything legitimate. I called ahead so he was expecting me, and his secretary brought me back to his office right away. Cameron was maybe 60 years old with gray hair and reading glasses, and he'd always been kind to me when I was younger and came to meetings with my dad. I sat down across from his desk and pulled out my phone, telling him I had something he needed to hear. I played the recording of Robert's confession, and I watched Cameron's face change from curious to shocked to absolutely furious as he listened. When the recording ended, Cameron took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, asking me how I managed to get Robert to admit all of this. I explained about finding out Robert lost his license for forgery and threatening to go to the police unless he cooperated. Cameron nodded slowly and said what I did was risky, but effective, and now we had exactly what we needed to challenge the fraudulent will in court. He opened his laptop and started pulling up legal forms, explaining that this was clear estate fraud, and we had an excellent case with Robert's confession, plus the other evidence I'd gathered. Cameron warned me that Diane would fight back hard once she realized what was happening, probably hiring an expensive lawyer and trying to discredit Robert and make me look like a bitter stepdaughter. He said the legal battle could take months and get ugly, but with this kind of evidence, we should ultimately win. Cameron asked if I was ready for that fight, and I told him I'd been ready since the day Diane handed me $5,000 and acted like she was doing me a favor. Cameron made some calls while I sat in his office, and after about 30 minutes he told me he'd contacted Ryan Giordano, a lawyer who specialized in estate fraud cases. Ryan had a reputation for being aggressive in court and not backing down when he knew he was right. Cameron explained that Ryan had won several high-profile cases involving forged wills and stolen inheritances, which was exactly the kind of experience we needed. Ryan agreed to meet with us that same afternoon, so Cameron and I drove over to Ryan's office in a newer building across town. Ryan was younger than Cameron, maybe 40, wearing an expensive suit and looking like someone who spent a lot of time in courtrooms. We sat in his conference room and I played the recording again while Ryan listened without interrupting. When it finished, Ryan leaned back in his chair and said this was one of the most straightforward fraud cases he'd seen in years. He explained that Robert's confession combined with the nurse's testimony about Diane guiding my dad's hand gave us everything we needed to prove the will was forged. Ryan said he'd take my case and that we should move fast before Diane could hide more assets or create additional complications. He started asking me detailed questions about my dad's estate, the construction company, and what Diane had done since my dad died. I told him about the planned sale to the developer, the money transfers to Justin and Bailey's accounts, and how Diane had evicted me from my own childhood home. Ryan took notes on everything and said we'd file a lawsuit challenging the will within the next few days. The next step was getting a formal statement from Natasha, the hospital nurse who'd witnessed Diane bringing papers for my dad to sign. I called her and explained that I was challenging my dad's will and needed her to provide an official statement about what she saw. Natasha agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near the hospital where she worked. She was maybe 50 years old, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. We sat at a corner table away from other people, and I explained the whole situation about the forged will and how Robert had confessed to creating it. Natasha looked sad, but not surprised, saying she'd felt uncomfortable watching Diane guide my dad's hand on those papers, but assumed it was legitimate insurance forms or something similar. She described how my dad was so weak he couldn't even hold a pen properly, and Diane had to wrap his fingers around it and move his whole hand across the page. Natasha said my dad's eyes were closed most of the time, and he didn't seem aware of what was happening. She remembered thinking it seemed wrong but not wanting to interfere with family matters, and now she felt guilty for not speaking up at the time. I told her she couldn't have known what Diane was really doing, and that her testimony now would help me get justice for my dad. Natasha agreed to provide a formal written statement and testify in court if needed, saying she wanted to do the right thing even though it came late. We spent about an hour going over exactly what she remembered, and I recorded notes on my phone to give to Ryan later. Ryan moved fast like he promised. Within 3 days, he filed an emergency motion to freeze all estate assets, so Diane couldn't sell the construction company or transfer any more money before our case got heard in court. The motion included Robert's confession, Natasha's statement, and all the evidence I'd gathered about the forged will and suspicious financial transfers. Ryan explained that getting the asset freeze was important because it would prevent Diane from hiding or spending everything before we could prove the will was fake. He said these motions usually took weeks to get heard, but he'd argued that there was immediate risk of irreparable harm to the estate, which convinced the judge to schedule a hearing within 48 hours. I went to the hearing with Ryan and Cameron, sitting in the courtroom while Ryan presented our evidence to the judge. Diane wasn't even there because her lawyer apparently didn't think the motion would be granted so fast. The judge listened to Ryan's arguments and looked through the evidence, and then he granted a temporary freeze on all estate assets pending a full hearing on the will challenge. Ryan turned to me and gave a small nod, and I felt this rush of satisfaction knowing Diane was about to find out that her plan was falling apart. The freeze meant she couldn't sell the company, couldn't transfer any more money, couldn't do anything with my dad's estate until the court sorted out who it really belonged to. Diane called me that same evening, and I could hear her screaming before I even got the phone all the way to my ear. She was demanding to know what I thought I was doing, threatening to sue me for harassment and claiming I was trying to steal from her family. I stayed completely calm, which seemed to make her even angrier. I told her she should probably talk to her lawyer about the asset freeze, and that I was just exercising my legal rights to challenge a will that I believed was fraudulent. Diane kept yelling about how ungrateful I was and how my dad would be ashamed of me for attacking his widow like this. I let her rant for maybe 30 seconds, and then I interrupted and said my dad would actually be ashamed of someone who forged his signature to steal his daughter's inheritance. Diane went quiet for a second, and then started screaming again about how she'd destroy me in court and make sure I never got a penny. I told her to have her lawyer call Ryan if she wanted to discuss anything further, and then I hung up while she was still yelling. I sat there on Tanya's couch feeling the satisfaction at finally rattling Diane's composure after months of her acting like she'd won, and I should just accept it. I kept spending time with Justin and Bailey over the next couple weeks, taking them to dinner and movies and pretending everything was normal. I felt guilty about using them for information, but I also knew they were innocent in all this, and I wanted to maintain our relationship. Bailey was the one who told me how their mom was handling the asset freeze, mentioning during dinner one night that Diane had been stress-eating ice cream every evening and making lots of phone calls to relatives asking for money. Bailey said her mom seemed really stressed and kept talking about lawyers being expensive and how she couldn't believe I was being so difficult. Justin added that their mom had been snapping at them over small things and seemed paranoid, like she thought everyone was against her. I listened and acted sympathetic, saying the legal stuff must be hard on everyone. But inside I felt this grim satisfaction knowing the asset freeze was hurting Diane exactly like it was supposed to, cutting off her access to money and forcing her to realize she couldn't just steal everything without consequences. Ryan called me a few days later and said we needed to hire a private investigator to document all of Diane's financial transfers and build a complete paper trail of how she'd looted the estate. He recommended someone named Kylie Meadows, who specialized in financial investigations for legal cases. Ryan explained that Kylie was expensive, charging $200 an hour, but she was worth every penny for cases like this, where we needed evidence that would hold up in court. I asked how much the total investigation might cost, and Ryan estimated maybe $10,000 to $15,000, depending on how long it took Kylie to track everything down. I hesitated because that was a lot of money, and I was living on savings and the $5,000 Diane had given me, but Ryan said this investment would pay off when we won the case and recovered everything Diane stole. I told him to hire Kylie, figuring I could put it on a credit card if I had to. Ryan set up a meeting for me with Kylie at her office, which was in a small building near the courthouse. Kylie turned out to be this sharp woman in her 30s with red hair and a no-nonsense attitude. She had 2 computer monitors on her desk and stacks of files. Everywhere, looking like someone who dealt with complicated financial crimes all the time. I explained the whole situation about Diane transferring money to accounts in Justin and Bailey's names, and Kylie started taking notes and asking specific questions about dates and amounts. She said she'd need access to my dad's bank records and business accounts, which Ryan could subpoena through the court. Kylie explained that financial investigations like this usually took 2 to 3 weeks because she had to trace money through multiple accounts and document every transfer with official records. She warned me that what she found might be worse than I expected, because people who commit estate fraud usually do more than just the obvious theft. I told her to dig into everything and find out exactly what Diane had done with my dad's money. Kylie said she'd start as soon as Ryan got her the bank records, and she'd send me updates every few days on what she discovered. 2 weeks later, Kylie called me with her preliminary findings. She'd traced over $300,000 that Diane had transferred to accounts in Justin and Bailey's names over the past 8 months. The transfers had started just 2 weeks after my dad got diagnosed with liver disease, which proved Diane had been planning this theft from the moment she knew he was dying. Kylie explained that the pattern showed clear intent to hide assets and avoid taxes, with transfers happening in amounts just small enough to avoid automatic reporting requirements. She'd also found evidence that Diane had been skimming money from the construction company accounts, paying herself a salary as office manager even though she didn't actually work there. Kylie said she was still tracking down more transfers and expected to find additional hidden money, but what she had so far was more than enough to prove Diane had systematically looted the estate. I thanked her and asked her to send everything to Ryan so he could add it to our lawsuit. After I hung up, I sat there feeling this mix of anger and vindication, knowing we now had documented proof of exactly what Diane had done. I needed to talk to Dean Broderick, the construction company foreman who'd worked with my dad for 15 years. Dean was the kind of guy who'd been loyal to my dad through everything, and I knew he'd be upset about what happened. I called him and asked if we could meet for coffee, and he agreed right away. We met at this diner near the company office, and Dean looked tired when he walked in, like he'd been carrying a heavy weight. He sat down across from me, and before I could even start talking, he said he was glad I called because he needed to tell me what was happening at the company. Dean explained that Diane's brother, who she'd brought in to help manage things, was running the business into the ground. Jobs were going over budget, clients were complaining about poor quality, and several longtime customers had taken their work elsewhere. Dean said half the crew was ready to quit if the company got sold to that developer, because the developer was known for cutting corners and treating workers badly. I told Dean about the lawsuit and the asset freeze, explaining that I was fighting to get the company back. Dean's whole face changed, looking relieved and determined. He said if I needed anything, any documentation or testimony about how Diane's brother had mismanaged things, he'd provide whatever I needed. He told me stories about my dad, and how much the crew had respected him, and how they all wanted to see his daughter running the company like he'd planned. I left that meeting feeling like I had an army behind me. Not just lawyers, but the people who'd actually built things alongside my dad for years. Dean called me the next day and said he had something I needed to see. I met him at a diner near the construction company office, and he brought a thick folder full of papers. He spread them across the table, showing me job reports, client complaints, and budget overruns from the past 8 months. Every single project Diane's brother had managed was either over budget or behind schedule or both. Dean pointed to one report about a kitchen renovation that should have cost $30,000, but ended up at $47,000 because Diane's brother ordered the wrong materials twice and had to eat the cost of returns. Another client had switched to a different company mid-project because the work quality was so bad they didn't trust us to finish. Dean showed me emails from longtime customers saying they were taking their business elsewhere after working with my dad for over a decade. The company's reputation was tanking fast, and Dean said at least 3 crew members had already quit to work for competitors. I took pictures of everything with my phone and thanked Dean for documenting all this. He told me my dad would be rolling over in his grave if he knew what his brother-in-law was doing to the business he'd spent 20 years building. I drove to the construction company office after leaving the diner. I hadn't been there since my dad died because Diane made it clear I wasn't welcome after she took over. The parking lot looked the same, but inside everything felt wrong. The reception area was messy with papers stacked everywhere, and the office manager looked stressed when she saw me walk in. I told her who I was, and she immediately started talking about how bad things had gotten. Plans were misfiled, so they couldn't find blueprints when inspectors showed up. Invoices sat unpaid for months, making suppliers angry. The computer system my dad had set up was ignored, and Diane's brother just kept everything on random sticky notes that got lost constantly. The office manager said she'd been looking for another job because Diane's brother was impossible to work with, and wouldn't listen when she tried to explain how my dad's systems worked. She showed me the filing cabinets, which were a complete disaster with documents just shoved in randomly instead of organized by project and date like my dad always did. I felt sick seeing how much damage had been done in less than a year. Ryan filed the formal lawsuit 3 days later. The legal documents named Diane, Robert, and Diane's brother as defendants in the estate fraud case. Ryan laid out everything in detailed legal language, including the forged signature, Robert's recorded confession, the nurse's testimony about Diane guiding my dad's hand, and all the suspicious financial transfers Kylie had documented. The lawsuit demanded the fraudulent will be thrown out, the legitimate will be enforced, and all assets returned to me immediately. Ryan also asked for damages to cover my legal fees and compensation for the stress and harm Diane caused. He filed it at the courthouse and had a process server deliver copies to Diane at my childhood home. I wasn't there to see her reaction, but I imagined her face when she opened that envelope and realized I had enough evidence to destroy her. Diane hired an expensive defense attorney within a week. His name was on some fancy letterhead, and Ryan said the guy charged $500 an hour. The attorney immediately started trying to discredit Robert, claiming in his response that Robert was lying to get revenge because Diane supposedly refused to pay him more money after the will was done. The response called Robert an unreliable witness with a history of legal problems and suggested he was making up the confession to avoid criminal charges himself. Diane's attorney also went after me, painting me as a bitter stepdaughter who couldn't accept that my father had changed his mind about the inheritance. The response claimed my dad had grown closer to Diane during his illness and decided she deserved everything for taking care of him. It said I was estranged from my dad and only showed up when I wanted money. Reading those lies made my blood boil, but Ryan told me to stay calm because desperate people say desperate things, and none of it would hold up against our evidence. 2 weeks later, I had to sit for a deposition at Diane's attorney's office. Ryan came with me and warned me the attorney would try to make me look bad with aggressive questions. The attorney was this older guy with gray hair and an expensive suit who acted friendly at first but turned mean fast. He asked about my relationship with my dad, trying to suggest we fought a lot or didn't get along. He asked if I had drug problems or gambling debts or any reason my dad wouldn't trust me with money. He brought up times I'd borrowed money from my dad in college and tried to make it sound like I was irresponsible and always asking for handouts. I stayed calm and answered every question honestly, explaining that my dad and I were close, that I worked with him every summer learning the business, and that he'd always promised everything would be mine. The attorney asked why my dad would marry Diane if he didn't trust her, and I said my dad was lonely, and Diane was good at pretending to be someone she wasn't. Ryan objected a few times when the questions got too personal, but mostly let me handle it. The deposition lasted 3 hours, and I was exhausted when it ended, but I knew I hadn't given them anything they could use against me. Justin called me 2 days after the deposition. He was crying and angry, saying his mom told him I was trying to steal everything from their family and leave them homeless. He said Diane claimed I was lying about the will and making up stories because I was jealous she got to take care of my dad when he was sick. I asked Justin to meet me for coffee so we could talk in person. We met at this place near his community college, and I brought copies of some of the evidence Ryan had gathered. I showed Justin the nurse's statement about watching Diane guide my dad's hand on documents. I showed him the signature comparison between my dad's real signature and the one on the fake will. I explained gently that his mom had forged documents to steal my inheritance, and that I had proof she'd been planning this since my dad got diagnosed. I didn't tell Justin that he and Bailey had been my information sources because I didn't want him to feel guilty about accidentally helping me. Justin stared at the documents for a long time without saying anything. His hands were shaking and he looked like he might throw up. He kept saying he didn't understand that his mom wouldn't do something like this, but he couldn't argue with the evidence right in front of him. He finally admitted his mom had been acting strange and paranoid lately, snapping at him and Bailey over nothing and making weird comments about lawyers and money. Justin said Diane had told him and Bailey they might need to talk to lawyers soon and that they should say my dad always talked about leaving everything to Diane. He realized now his mom was trying to get them to lie under oath. Justin put his head in his hands and said he felt sick thinking about what his mom had done to my dad when he was dying. I told Justin I was sorry he was caught in the middle of this, but that I had to fight for what my dad wanted me to have. Bailey texted me that night asking if what Justin told her was true. I called her instead of texting back and confirmed everything. Bailey was quiet for a minute, then said she'd found more documents in Diane's room that afternoon. She sent me photos of papers showing Diane had been looking at houses in California and had already contacted a private school there about enrolling Bailey for the fall semester. The documents showed Diane was planning to use money from selling my dad's company to buy a house in some expensive neighborhood and pay for Bailey's tuition at a school that cost $40,000 a year. There were also printed emails between Diane and the developer discussing the timeline for the property sale and how much Diane would walk away with after everything was liquidated. Bailey said she felt stupid for not seeing what her mom was doing earlier and asked if I hated her for being Diane's daughter. I told her I didn't hate her at all and that none of this was her fault. Kylie finished her investigation a week later and called me to her office to present her findings. She'd put together this massive report with bank statements, property records, transfer documents, and a detailed timeline of everything Diane had done. The report showed Diane had started moving money the same week my dad got his diagnosis, transferring funds in amounts just small enough to avoid automatic reporting to the government. Kylie had tracked over $400,000 that Diane had hidden in various accounts, including the ones in Justin and Bailey's names. The report documented how Diane had paid herself a salary from the company even though she never actually worked there, skimming another $60,000 over 8 months. Kylie had found evidence of Diane researching estate law and looking up information about forging signatures weeks before my dad died. The timeline made it impossible to claim this was anything other than planned, systematic fraud. Kylie said this was one of the clearest cases of estate theft she'd ever investigated, and that Diane had left a paper trail a mile long because she'd gotten greedy and sloppy. Ryan reviewed Kylie's report and said we were in an excellent position. He suggested approaching Diane's attorney about a settlement where she would return all the assets and agree not to contest the legitimate will in exchange for me not pursuing criminal charges. Ryan said this would wrap everything up faster and save me the stress of a long trial. I sat there thinking about it for maybe 10 seconds before I told Ryan absolutely not. I said I wanted Diane to face real consequences for what she did, not just slink away with a slap on the wrist after stealing from a dying man. I wanted her charged with fraud and forgery and elder abuse and whatever else the prosecutor could make stick. Ryan nodded and said he understood, that some clients want justice more than they want convenience. He told me to prepare for this to get uglier before it got better because Diane would fight hard once she realized she was going to lose everything, and possibly go to prison. Ryan called me 2 days after we turned down the settlement offer and said the developer wanted to meet with me personally. The guy's name was Mark something, and he'd been negotiating with Diane to buy the construction company for months. But Dean had apparently been filling his ear with warnings about how badly things were falling apart under Diane's brother's management. Ryan said Mark was getting cold feet about the whole deal and wanted to talk about possibly working with me instead once the estate mess got sorted out. I met Mark at a coffee shop downtown, and he turned out to be this older guy in his 50s who seemed genuinely concerned about the company's reputation. He told me Dean had shown him examples of sloppy work that never would have happened under my dad's watch, projects running way over budget, clients complaining about missed deadlines. Mark said he'd been in construction development for 30 years, and he could tell when a company was being run into the ground. He asked me about my experience working with my dad, and seemed impressed when I described all the summers I'd spent learning the trade. Mark said if I ended up winning the estate case, he'd rather negotiate with me than Diane, because at least I cared about maintaining quality, instead of just cashing out as fast as possible. He gave me his card, and told me to call him when things settled down, then paid for my coffee and left. I sat there for a while after he was gone, feeling this weird mix of hope and pressure because now there was someone actually betting on me to fix this whole disaster. The next hearing was 3 weeks later, and Diane showed up with a new strategy that caught everyone off guard. Her attorney stood up and claimed my dad had verbally promised Diane everything during his illness, that the written will was just formalizing his spoken wishes, and that I was twisting the situation to make it look like fraud, when really, I just couldn't accept my dad's decision. The attorney said he had witnesses who could testify to my dad's intentions, and then he called Justin and Bailey to the stand. My stomach dropped when I saw them walk into the courtroom because I knew exactly what Diane had done. She'd coached them to lie for her, probably told them they'd lose everything if they didn't back her up. Justin went first, and the attorney asked him if he remembered my dad ever talking about the estate. Justin looked miserable and said, yeah, he remembered some conversations. The attorney asked what my dad said, and Justin stammered through this obviously rehearsed speech about how my dad wanted to make sure Diane was taken care of, how he appreciated her nursing him through his illness, how he wanted the family to stay together. But when Ryan cross-examined Justin, the whole thing fell apart in minutes. Ryan asked Justin to describe specific details about these conversations, like where they happened, what room they were in, who else was present. Justin couldn't answer any of it. He kept saying he didn't remember the exact details, but he was sure the conversations happened. Ryan asked if Diane had told him what to say, and Justin went pale and said no, but it was obvious he was lying. Then Ryan asked if Justin actually remembered my dad making any promises about the estate, or if he was just repeating what his mom told him. And Justin broke down and admitted his mom had told him what to say, and he didn't actually remember my dad promising her anything. Bailey's testimony went even worse for Diane. She was crying before she even sat down, and when the attorney asked her the same questions. He'd asked Justin. She just kept shaking her head and saying she was sorry. Ryan didn't even need to cross-examine her because she admitted on direct examination that Diane had told her exactly what to say, and threatened that they'd all end up homeless if Bailey didn't help. The judge looked furious, and asked Diane's attorney if he'd known his client was planning to use her children as false witnesses. The attorney looked genuinely shocked and said he absolutely had not known, that Diane had assured him the children had relevant testimony about the deceased's intentions. The judge told Diane's attorney to control his client, and warned that attempting to suborn perjury was a serious matter that could result in additional charges. Diane was sitting at the defense table looking like she wanted to disappear, and her attorney kept leaning over to whisper angrily at her while she stared at the table. The hearing ended with the judge saying he was even more convinced that Diane had engaged in systematic fraud, and that her attempt to manipulate her own children into lying under oath showed a pattern of deceptive behavior that undermined any credibility she might have had left. Ryan looked satisfied when we left the courthouse, but I felt sick about the whole thing. I went back to Tanya's apartment and just sat on the couch, staring at nothing for like an hour. Tanya came home from work and found me there and asked what happened at the hearing. I told her about Justin and Bailey and how Diane had tried to make them lie for her, and how watching them fall apart on the stand made me feel like the worst person in the world. Tanya sat down next to me and said I needed to stop blaming myself for Diane's choices. She said Diane was the one who stole from a dying man. Diane was the one who forged documents. Diane was the one who tried to manipulate her own kids into committing perjury. I said I knew all that, but Justin and Bailey were going to lose their home, and their mom might go to prison, and it was happening because I decided to fight back, instead of just accepting the $5,000 and walking away. Tanya grabbed my shoulders and made me look at her. She said if I'd walked away, Diane would have sold everything my dad built and moved to California, and Justin and Bailey would have grown up thinking it was okay to steal and lie as long as you didn't get caught. She said I was teaching them that actions have consequences, and that sometimes doing the right thing means people get hurt, but that doesn't make it the wrong choice. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't stop seeing Justin's face when he admitted his mom told him to lie. The judge ordered Diane to produce all financial records related to the estate within 1 week, including bank statements, property documents, and any records of transfers or sales. Diane's attorney tried to stall by claiming some documents had been lost or destroyed in a basement flood at Diane's house. The judge didn't buy it for a second. He said it was awfully convenient that the missing documents were exactly the ones that would show where Diane had hidden money, and if Diane didn't produce complete records within 7 days, he would impose sanctions including daily fines and possible contempt charges. He said it was clear to him that Diane was hiding evidence, and he wasn't going to let her delay justice any longer. Diane's attorney tried to argue that 7 days wasn't enough time to gather everything, but the judge shut him down and said Diane had months to prepare for this, and if she'd been keeping proper records like any honest executor would, producing them shouldn't be a problem. The attorney sat down looking defeated, and Diane was crying again, which seemed to be her only strategy at this point. Kylie called me 4 days later with information that changed everything again. She'd been digging through bank records and found something interesting about timing. Diane had opened a safe deposit box at a bank across town exactly 3 weeks after my dad died, right around when she would have been gathering assets and figuring out what she could hide. Kylie couldn't access the box without a court order, but she could see the rental records and the box was still active. Ryan immediately filed a motion to subpoena the bank records and access the safe deposit box, arguing that Diane had likely been storing hidden assets there. The judge granted it within 24 hours. 2 days later, Ryan called me to his office and showed me what the bank had turned over. The safe deposit box contained $73,000 in cash bundled in stacks of hundreds, plus a notebook with handwritten records showing where the money came from. Diane had been skimming from the construction company accounts in small amounts over 8 months, taking cash from jobs and pocketing deposits from clients, basically stealing from my dad's business while pretending to help manage it. The notebook had dates and amounts that matched up perfectly with company records once Kylie cross-referenced everything. Ryan said this was the final nail in Diane's coffin because it proved she'd been planning to steal from the estate even before my dad died, and the fact that she'd hidden the cash and never reported it to the court showed consciousness of guilt. I drove to the cemetery for the first time since my dad's funeral, because I needed to talk to him even though I knew he couldn't answer. The grave had a simple headstone with his name and dates, and the words "Builder of Dreams" that I'd picked out before Diane evicted me. I sat down in the grass next to it and just started talking. I told him about the lawsuit and Diane's lies and how Justin and Bailey got caught in the middle. I told him about the safe deposit box and the $70,000 in cash, and how Diane had been stealing from him even while he was dying. I said I was sorry it took me so long to visit, but I'd been so focused on fighting for his legacy that I hadn't let myself grieve properly. I told him the construction company was falling apart under Diane's brother, and I was scared I wouldn't be able to fix it even if I won everything back. I promised him I wouldn't let Diane destroy what he'd built, that I'd fight for every brick and board and business relationship he'd spent decades creating. I sat there for probably an hour just crying and talking until I didn't have any words left. When I finally drove away, I felt emptied out, but also more determined than ever. Diane's attorney withdrew from the case 2 days before the next scheduled hearing. He filed a motion citing irreconcilable differences with his client and asking to be removed from representation. Ryan explained this usually meant the attorney had discovered his client lied to him or refused to follow legal advice, and no lawyer wants to stay on a case where the client keeps making things worse. The judge granted the withdrawal but refused to delay the proceedings, telling Diane she had 48 hours to find new representation or she'd have to represent herself. Ryan said this was actually great for us because it showed Diane was running out of money and options, but he warned me that desperate people do unpredictable things and I needed to stay alert. Diane showed up to the next hearing with a new attorney who looked like he'd passed the bar exam last week. The guy kept stumbling over basic procedural terms and filed a motion to dismiss. That got denied before he even finished reading it aloud. He tried to argue that the evidence against Diane was circumstantial and didn't prove intent, which made the judge actually laugh out loud. The judge said there were signed confessions, witness testimony, financial records, and Diane's own recorded statements, and if the attorney thought that was circumstantial, then perhaps he needed to review his evidence law textbook. Diane's new attorney turned red and sat down without saying anything else. Ryan leaned over and whispered that this was exactly what he'd hoped for, that Diane had clearly scraped the bottom of the barrel and couldn't afford competent representation anymore. He said we needed to stay focused, though, because even bad lawyers can get lucky sometimes, and Diane might try something desperate when she realized she was completely out of options. Justin called me that night and said he'd moved out of Diane's house. He was staying with friends from high school and sleeping on their couch because he couldn't stand being around his mom anymore. He said watching her try to make him and Bailey lie in court made him realize how much she'd been manipulating him his whole life. He apologized for not seeing through it earlier and said he wished he'd gotten to know my dad better when he had the chance, instead of just seeing him as the guy who bought him stuff. I told Justin it wasn't his fault, and that my dad would have been proud of him for choosing honesty even when it was hard. Justin said he didn't know what was going to happen to him and Bailey, but at least now he understood why I was fighting so hard, and he hoped I won everything back because Diane didn't deserve any of it. Bailey's call came 3 days after Justin moved out. Her voice shook when she asked if I could meet her at the coffee shop near campus. I got there first and watched her walk in looking smaller than usual, eyes red like she'd been crying for hours. She sat down across from me and just started talking about how Diane was losing it, pacing the house at night and muttering about everyone conspiring against her. Bailey said her mom accused her of being a spy, going through her phone and demanding to know who she was texting. I told Bailey she could stay with me and Tanya if she needed to get out of there. She twisted her napkin into shreds and said she felt guilty leaving her mom alone when everything was falling apart, even though she knew what Diane did was horrible and wrong. I reminded her that Diane made her own choices, and Bailey didn't owe her loyalty after watching her forge documents and steal from my dying father. Bailey nodded but kept crying, caught between knowing the right thing and feeling like a bad daughter for abandoning her mom. The detective called me 2 days later asking if I could come to the station for an interview. He was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and tired eyes that had probably seen every kind of fraud case there was. He sat me down in a small room with a recorder and asked detailed questions about my dad's condition in those final weeks, how alert he was, whether he could write his own name. I described watching him struggle to lift a water glass, how the medication made him drift in and out of consciousness, how Diane controlled who visited and when. The detective took notes and asked about Diane's behavior during that time, whether she seemed rushed or nervous, if I noticed her bringing paperwork to the hospital. I told him about the nurse remembering Diane with documents, about Robert's confession, about finding the forged signature that looked nothing like my dad's real handwriting. He leaned back and said they were building a case for forgery and elder financial abuse, charges that could mean serious prison time for Diane. He warned me the trial would be hard, and Diane's lawyers would try to make me look vindictive, but he believed we had enough evidence to get a conviction. Ryan called me the next morning with news that Robert had agreed to testify against Diane in exchange for a plea deal on reduced charges. The prosecutors offered him probation instead of jail time if he gave them everything about how the fraud scheme was planned and carried out. Robert's testimony included details about Diane researching my dad's signature for weeks before creating the fake will, practicing the forgery on scratch paper until she could match the basic shape. He described meetings where Diane planned exactly when to bring the documents to the hospital, timing it for when my dad would be most heavily medicated and least able to resist. Ryan said Robert's cooperation gave prosecutors everything they needed to prove premeditation and intent, turning this from a possible mistake into clear criminal fraud. I felt sick hearing how calculated it all was, how Diane had spent weeks preparing to steal from my dying father instead of just letting him rest in peace. Dean called me that afternoon asking if I wanted to come by the construction company and meet with the employees. I hadn't been back since taking those pictures of the messy office weeks ago. Walking through the door felt strange, like entering a place that should have been mine all along but got stolen and broken in my absence. The crew was gathered in the main workspace, and when Dean introduced me as the boss's daughter fighting to get the company back, they all started clapping. It caught me off guard, and I just stood there while these men who'd worked with my dad for years gave me a standing ovation. They took turns telling me stories about my dad, how he always made sure jobs were done right even if it cost more money, how he treated every worker with respect and paid fair wages when other companies were cutting corners. One older guy named Frank said my dad once stopped an entire project because he found out a subcontractor was using cheap materials, eating the cost himself rather than compromise on quality. Another guy told me about the time my dad personally drove to the hospital when a crew member got hurt, staying there until he knew the guy would be okay. Hearing these stories reminded me this fight wasn't just about money or property. It was about preserving what my dad built and the way he treated people. Dean pulled me aside after everyone went back to work and asked if I was planning to run the company myself once the legal stuff got settled. The question threw me because I hadn't let myself think that far ahead, too focused on just getting through each day of the court battle. I told him I needed to finish fighting Diane first before I could plan anything else. But standing there in the office my dad designed, surrounded by equipment he bought and projects he started, the idea of continuing his work felt right in a way nothing else had since he died. Dean nodded and said the crew would follow me if I proved I cared about quality and people the way my dad did, that they were tired of Diane's brother running things into the ground and wanted real leadership again. I promised to think about it seriously once I knew whether I'd actually get the company back, or if Diane would somehow manage to destroy it completely before the courts made a final decision. I was asleep on Tanya's couch at 2 a.m. when someone started pounding on the apartment door. Tanya came out of her bedroom looking scared, and I grabbed my phone ready to call the police. Then I heard Diane's voice slurring through the door, crying and begging me to let her in so we could talk. Tanya immediately dialed the police while I started recording on my phone, keeping it pointed at the door as Diane's rambling got louder. She was drunk, words running together as she pleaded for me to drop the lawsuit and promised to give me half of everything if I just stopped trying to destroy her. I stayed quiet and kept recording while she admitted she was scared of going to prison, that she knew the will was fake, but she'd been desperate and made a mistake. She said my dad would have wanted us to work this out as family, that he wouldn't want her kids to suffer because of one bad choice. The police arrived within 10 minutes, and I opened the door to show them Diane leaning against the hallway wall, mascara running down her face and reeking of alcohol. They asked if I wanted to press charges, and I said yes, explaining about the restraining order Ryan had filed after Diane's threatening phone calls weeks ago. The officers arrested Diane for trespassing and violating the restraining order, reading her rights while she cried and tried to explain she just wanted to talk to her stepdaughter. One officer asked if I had any evidence of what happened, and I showed him the recording on my phone, Diane's voice clear as she admitted knowing the will was fake. He said the recording would help our case and asked me to email a copy to the detective handling the fraud investigation, watching the police car drive away with Diane in the back seat. I felt a weird mix of satisfaction and guilt. Tanya put her arm around me and said Diane did this to herself, that showing up drunk and confessing on tape was just more proof she was guilty and desperate. Ryan called me first thing in the morning after I sent him the recording, and he sounded excited in that controlled lawyer way. He said Diane's late-night visit and recorded confession showed consciousness of guilt, which meant she knew she'd done something wrong and was trying to fix it before facing consequences. The recording would strengthen our case even more by providing another confession on record, and the restraining order violation would make her look unstable and willing to break rules to get what she wanted. Ryan filed a motion for summary judgment 3 days later, arguing that Diane's multiple confessions and the mountain of evidence made a trial unnecessary. He explained that summary judgment meant asking the judge to rule in our favor without going through a full trial, because the facts were so clear that no reasonable jury could side with Diane. The judge scheduled a hearing to consider the motion for 2 weeks out. Ryan said if the judge granted summary judgment, we could have this whole thing resolved within weeks instead of dragging through months of trial preparation and court dates. I wanted to feel excited, but mostly just felt tired, worn down by months of fighting and investigating and waiting for the legal system to move at its slow pace. Ryan reminded me we were close to the finish line, and that Diane was running out of options and money, her desperate moves only helping prove our case stronger. Bailey showed up at Tanya's apartment the next morning with 2 suitcases and asked if she could stay with us for a while. I said yes, even though the apartment was already cramped with me on the couch, and Bailey would have to sleep on an air mattress in the corner. She looked relieved and exhausted, like she'd been carrying something heavy for too long and finally got permission to put it down. Tanya helped her get settled and made coffee while Bailey explained she couldn't stay in that house anymore, watching her mom spiral and knowing everything was built on lies. I told her she could stay as long as she needed, and that choosing honesty over loyalty to someone doing wrong things was harder than most people realized. Bailey thanked me about 5 times and said she felt guilty, but also lighter, like she could finally breathe without her mom watching every move and asking questions about where she was going and who she talked to. Bailey started telling me stories about life with Diane before my dad came along, describing years of moving between apartments when rent came due, and Diane didn't have money. She said they'd lived with 3 different boyfriends in 2 years, her mom always looking for someone to take care of them financially. Bailey remembered being 12 and watching Diane research my dad online after they met at the grocery store, finding out about his construction company and the house he owned. She said her mom spent weeks planning how to run into him again, pretending it was coincidence when she showed up at places she knew he'd be. Bailey felt guilty for not warning my dad, but explained she was just a kid who wanted her mom to be happy and stable for once, tired of moving and changing schools and never knowing if they'd have enough money for food. I told Bailey she wasn't responsible for her mom's choices, and that kids shouldn't have to protect adults from other adults. But hearing how calculated Diane had been from the very start, how she'd targeted my grieving father as a meal ticket, and planned everything years before the fake will, made me even more determined to make sure she faced real consequences for what she'd done. The summary judgment hearing started at 9 in the morning, and Ryan met me outside the courthouse looking confident in his dark suit. He carried a thick folder of evidence and told me to stay calm no matter what Diane's lawyer said, reminding me the facts were on our side. We walked into the courtroom and I saw Diane already sitting at the defendant's table with her cheap lawyer, both of them looking nervous and unprepared. The judge entered and everyone stood. Then we sat down and Ryan started presenting our case methodically. He laid out Robert's confession, the nurse's testimony, the forged signature analysis, and the financial records showing Diane's theft. Diane's lawyer tried to argue that Robert was lying for revenge, and that the signature differences could be explained by my dad's illness. The judge interrupted him twice to ask for actual evidence supporting these claims instead of speculation, and the lawyer fumbled through his papers without finding anything useful. Ryan systematically destroyed every argument, showing how the timeline proved Diane planned everything from the moment my dad got sick. The judge asked Diane's lawyer if he had any credible witnesses or documentation to contradict our evidence, and the lawyer admitted he did not. Diane sat there looking smaller and smaller, her face pale and her hands shaking on the table. I felt this weird mix of satisfaction and sadness watching her realize she was losing everything, because part of me remembered when she first married my dad and seemed happy. The judge asked if there were any other arguments and Diane's lawyer shook his head, clearly giving up. Ryan stood and requested summary judgment, arguing no reasonable jury could side with Diane given the overwhelming evidence of fraud. The judge nodded and said he would issue his ruling immediately since the facts were indeed clear. The judge declared the forged will completely invalid and reinstated my dad's legitimate will that left everything to me. He ordered Diane to return all assets including the house, the construction company, the investment accounts, and every penny she'd transferred or spent. Diane started crying at the defendant's table, but the judge kept talking, saying she also had to pay my legal fees, which had reached over $60,000 by now. He set a deadline of 30 days for full asset return, and said failure to comply would result in contempt charges. Diane's lawyer tried to ask for more time, but the judge shut him down, pointing out Diane had already proven she would hide or destroy assets if given the chance. Ryan squeezed my shoulder as we stood to leave, and I felt dizzy with relief that this part was finally over. Outside the courtroom, Ryan explained the next steps and warned me Diane would probably appeal, but it was just a delaying tactic. The evidence was too strong for any appeals court to overturn the judgment, and the appeal process could take months, but wouldn't stop me from taking possession of everything. I asked what would happen if Diane just refused to return things, and Ryan said we could get the sheriff involved to enforce the court order. We walked to his car, and he drove me back to Tanya's apartment, talking about next steps and asset recovery procedures. 3 days later, Diane's lawyer filed an appeal claiming the judge made errors in his ruling and didn't properly consider Diane's evidence. Ryan called me laughing about it, saying there was no evidence to consider, and the appeal was transparently just trying to delay the inevitable. He explained he'd already filed a motion asking the judge to deny a stay of judgment, meaning Diane would have to start returning assets immediately, even while the appeal was pending. The judge granted our motion the same day, ordering Diane to begin transferring everything back within 1 week. Ryan said this was huge because it meant we didn't have to wait months for the appeal to fail before I could reclaim what was mine. I asked him how long the appeal would take, and he estimated 6 to 9 months, but said it would get denied at every level because our case was so solid. Diane's lawyer sent Ryan a nasty letter threatening sanctions for harassment, which Ryan said was just posturing since we were following proper legal procedures. I started making lists of everything I needed to do once I took possession, feeling overwhelmed by the logistics of taking over a whole construction company and moving back into my childhood home. Tanya helped me organize my thoughts and reminded me I didn't have to do everything at once, just take it one step at a time. The asset transfer happened exactly 1 week after the judge's order, and I met Ryan at the county clerk's office to sign papers. Diane wasn't there, having sent her lawyer to hand over the house keys and business documents with a scowl on his face. I held the keys to my childhood home in my hand and felt surreal, like I'd traveled back in time, but everything was different now. Ryan drove me to the house and I walked up to the front door with my heart pounding, not sure what I'd find inside. I unlocked the door and stepped into the entryway, immediately noticing the walls had holes punched in them, and several light fixtures were missing. The living room furniture was gone, and there were stains on the carpet that definitely weren't there before. I walked through each room finding more damage, like Diane had gone on a destruction spree before leaving. My dad's office had been completely trashed with papers scattered everywhere and his desk drawers broken. The kitchen cabinets were empty, and she'd apparently taken or destroyed most of the dishes and appliances. I found my old bedroom, and it looked untouched, which somehow made me angrier because it showed Diane specifically targeted things that mattered to my dad. Ryan followed me through the house taking photos for documentation, saying we could sue for the damage and missing items. I sat on the floor in my dad's destroyed office and cried for the first time since the funeral, not from sadness but from rage at how petty and cruel Diane had been. The construction company was in even worse shape than the house when Dean met me there the next morning. He walked me through the office showing me stacks of unpaid bills from suppliers, angry emails from clients, and employee records that were a complete mess. Diane's brother had apparently stopped paying vendors months ago while still collecting money from clients, pocketing the difference. Dean explained 3 major clients had canceled contracts because work wasn't getting done on time and the quality was terrible. The crew was down to half its original size because good workers quit, rather than deal with the chaos. I sat in my dad's old office chair and looked at the mountain of problems, feeling totally overwhelmed by how much work it would take to fix everything. Dean put a hand on my shoulder and said we could rebuild, but I needed to be realistic about the timeline. It would take at least 6 months to pay off debts, repair relationships with suppliers, and win back client trust. He offered to help me create a recovery plan, and said the remaining crew was loyal and willing to work hard if I could give them leadership and stability. We spent the rest of the day going through files and making lists of priorities, starting with which bills were most urgent, and which clients might give us another chance. I hired back the office manager who'd been planning to quit, a woman in her 50s named Linda who'd worked for my dad for 10 years. She was grateful for the raise I offered, and the authority to actually manage things properly, instead of being ignored like Diane's brother had done. Linda worked overtime that first week, helping me understand the business side of construction that my dad never taught me. She showed me how to read financial statements, manage payroll, and track job costs versus revenue. We created a system for catching up on overdue paperwork, and she contacted suppliers to negotiate payment plans for the outstanding bills. Linda knew which clients had been loyal to my dad and might be willing to work with us again if we proved things were different now. She also knew which employees were problems versus which ones were solid workers being held back by bad management. I learned more about running a business in those first 2 weeks than I had in years of working construction with my dad. Linda told me stories about my dad's business philosophy and how he always prioritized quality and treating people fairly, which had built the company's reputation before Diane destroyed it. Justin showed up at the construction company office one afternoon looking nervous and asking to talk to Dean. I watched from my dad's office as Justin apologized to Dean and the other workers for his mom's brother ruining everything. He said he knew it wasn't his fault, but he felt guilty anyway because his family had benefited from the theft. Dean told him he appreciated the apology, but Justin didn't need to carry his mom's guilt, that kids aren't responsible for their parents' crimes. Justin asked if there were any jobs available because he'd gotten hired at a warehouse but wanted to learn construction properly. Dean looked at me and I nodded, so he told Justin to come back Monday ready to work hard and follow instructions. Justin thanked us both and left looking relieved, like he'd been carrying something heavy and finally got to put it down. Dean came to my office after and said Justin seemed like a good kid who got dealt a bad hand with Diane as a mother. I agreed and said everyone deserved a chance to build something better than what they came from. The prosecutor called me 2 weeks after I took possession of everything, saying Diane's criminal trial date was set for 3 months out. She explained they had an overwhelming case with Robert's testimony about the forgery, the nurse's statement about the signature manipulation, and multiple recordings of Diane confessing. The prosecutor expected Diane to take a plea deal, rather than risk a trial that could result in 5 to 7 years in prison. She asked if I wanted to give a victim impact statement at sentencing, and I said yes, wanting Diane to hear directly how her fraud affected me. The prosecutor warned me that plea deals usually meant reduced sentences, maybe 2 years with probation, which frustrated me because it seemed too light for what Diane did. She explained that trials were expensive and unpredictable, and a guaranteed conviction with some prison time was better than risking an acquittal. I understood the logic, but still felt angry that Diane might only serve 2 years for stealing my entire inheritance and destroying my dad's legacy. The prosecutor promised to push for the maximum sentence allowed under the plea agreement and to include restitution requirements for all the damage Diane caused. I threw myself into rebuilding the construction company, working 16-hour days and learning aspects of the business my dad never taught me. Linda showed me how to estimate job costs and write proposals, while Dean taught me about managing crews and dealing with difficult clients. I spent evenings reviewing project plans and mornings meeting with suppliers to rebuild relationships. The work was exhausting but fulfilling, and I felt close to my dad when I solved problems the way he would have. I found his old notebooks with job notes and business ideas, reading them late at night and feeling like he was still teaching me. Dean told me I had good instincts for the work and just needed more experience with the business side. We landed a small renovation project from a client who remembered my dad fondly, and I poured everything into making sure it was perfect. The crew responded to having clear leadership and proper management, working harder than they had in months. I started seeing how the company could not just recover, but actually grow beyond what my dad built, adding new services and modern techniques while keeping his commitment to quality. Bailey enrolled in community college for the spring semester and got a part-time job at a coffee shop near campus. She moved into a tiny studio apartment that I helped her afford by covering the security deposit, wanting her to have independence and stability. Bailey came by Tanya's apartment one evening to thank me and said working and going to the school felt good, like she was finally building her own life instead of depending on her mom's schemes. She told me the coffee shop job was teaching her responsibility, and her classes were harder than she expected, but she was keeping up. Bailey said she was grateful I gave her a place to stay when she left Diane's house and helped her see she didn't have to follow her mom's pattern of looking for someone else to take care of her. I told her I was proud of how hard she was working and that building your own life was harder than relying on others, but way more satisfying. She hugged me and said she wished she'd had a sister like me growing up instead of watching her mom manipulate people. I reminded her she was still young and had time to create whatever life she wanted, that her mom's choices didn't define her future. Justin called me about 2 weeks later, asking if I could meet him at this diner near the construction company office. He sounded nervous on the phone, saying he had something important to tell me. When I got there, he was already in a booth, stirring his coffee and looking uncomfortable. He told me about a client who'd called the office that morning, someone named Mr. Anderson, who worked with my dad on a big custom home project about 5 years ago. Mr. Anderson heard I was running things now and wanted to talk about building another house, this time for his daughter who was getting married. Justin said the guy specifically asked for me because he remembered how my dad always talked about teaching me the business and how proud he was of my work ethic. I felt this weird pressure settle in my chest, knowing this was our first real chance to prove the company could survive under my leadership. Mr. Anderson came by the office the next afternoon, a tall guy in his 60s with gray hair and kind eyes that reminded me of my dad. He shook my hand and said he was sorry for my loss, that my dad was one of the most honest contractors he'd ever worked with. He explained his daughter wanted a custom home similar to the one my dad built for him, with some modern updates and green building features. I walked him through some preliminary ideas, trying to remember everything my dad taught me about client consultations and design planning. Mr. Anderson listened carefully and asked smart questions about materials and timelines. Before he left, he told me he was taking a chance on me because he trusted my dad's judgment about people, and my dad always said I had integrity and talent. He hoped I inherited those qualities because he was betting a lot of money on it. The contract came through a week later, a custom home project worth almost $400,000. Dean looked at the paperwork and whistled, saying this was exactly the kind of work that could turn the company's reputation around. I spent the next few days working on design plans and material estimates, barely sleeping because I was so determined to get everything perfect. The pressure felt enormous, knowing one mistake could cost us this client and any future referrals he might send our way. Ryan called me on a Tuesday morning to say Diane's attorney contacted him about a plea deal. The prosecutor was offering 2 years in prison, 5 years probation, and full restitution of all assets plus damages for pain and suffering. Diane would have to publicly admit to forging the will and committing elder financial abuse, and she'd be permanently banned from serving as anyone's executor or having power of attorney ever again. Ryan said it was a solid deal that guaranteed consequences without the risk of a trial, where juries could be unpredictable. I asked what would happen if we went to trial instead, and he explained we might get a longer sentence, but we also might get an acquittal if Diane's lawyer managed to create reasonable doubt. The prosecutor was confident but realistic, knowing that putting my dad's nurse and Robert on the stand meant exposing them to cross-examination that could damage their credibility. I felt frustrated that 2 years seemed too light for stealing everything my dad worked for, but Ryan reminded me that Diane would also have to pay back every penny plus damages, which would financially ruin her. The plea deal included a clause requiring her to sell her car and jewelry to help cover restitution, and she'd be monitored for 5 years to make sure she wasn't hiding assets. I told Ryan to accept the deal because I wanted guaranteed justice, even if it wasn't as much prison time as I thought she deserved. He said the sentencing hearing would happen in about 3 weeks and I'd have a chance to give a victim impact statement if I wanted. I definitely wanted to, needing Diane to hear exactly how her fraud affected my life and destroyed my ability to grieve my father properly. The courthouse was cold and sterile on the day of Diane's sentencing, with fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and clinical. I sat in the gallery with Tanya beside me for support, watching Diane walk in with her cheap lawyer. She looked smaller somehow, wearing a plain blue dress instead of her usual flashy clothes. The prosecutor went first, laying out the facts of the case and explaining why the plea deal served justice while saving taxpayer money on a trial. Diane's lawyer tried to paint her as a desperate woman who made bad choices out of fear for her children's future, which made me want to scream. Then the judge asked if I wanted to give my victim impact statement. I walked to the front with my written speech, my hands shaking slightly as I unfolded the paper. I started by describing how my dad's death should have been a time for grieving and remembering him, but instead I had to fight for my own inheritance while being evicted from my childhood home. I explained the stress of discovering the forgery, the fear of losing everything my dad built, and the pain of watching Diane try to destroy his legacy for her own greed. I talked about being 23 years old and suddenly homeless, relying on my cousin's generosity because my stepmother stole my security and future. I described finding my dad's old notebooks and project files, reading his handwriting and feeling close to him, only to remember that Diane tried to erase all of that by selling the company to developers who would tear down the house he designed. My voice cracked when I mentioned how Diane manipulated her own children, using them as pawns and setting them up to potentially face legal trouble for her financial schemes. I finished by saying Diane didn't just steal money and property. She stole my chance to grieve my father in peace and forced me to become someone focused on legal battles instead of healing. When I sat down, Tanya squeezed my hand, and I realized I was crying. The judge took off his glasses and looked directly at Diane before announcing her sentence. He said the case showed a disturbing pattern of exploiting a dying man for financial gain, then manipulating everyone around her to cover up the fraud. He noted that Diane guided my dad's hand to forge his signature when he was too weak to hold a pen, which showed calculated cruelty rather than a momentary lapse in judgment. The judge also mentioned how Diane tried to use Justin and Bailey as false witnesses, putting her own children at risk of perjury charges to protect herself. He said this wasn't someone who made one mistake out of desperation, but rather someone who carefully planned and executed a scheme to steal an entire estate. The judge sentenced Diane to the full 2 years in prison with no possibility of early release, plus 5 years of probation with strict financial monitoring. He ordered her to pay full restitution of all assets and an additional $50,000 in damages for emotional distress and legal costs. Diane would be banned forever from serving as executor, having power of attorney, or managing anyone else's finances in any capacity. The judge also ordered her to write a formal apology acknowledging her crimes, which would be filed as part of the public record. Diane started crying when he finished, saying she was sorry and that she never meant to hurt anyone. Her lawyer put his hand on her shoulder, but she kept sobbing, saying she just wanted to take care of her kids and didn't know what else to do. It felt fake to me, like she was performing for the judge rather than actually feeling remorse. She wasn't sorry for what she did, she was sorry she got caught and had to face consequences. The bailiff led her away in handcuffs while she was still crying, and I felt this strange, empty feeling watching her go. Not satisfaction exactly, but maybe relief that it was finally done. Justin and Bailey both chose not to speak at the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back row and watching everything happen in silence. After Diane was taken into custody, neither of them went to visit her at the jail or even called to check on her. Bailey came by Tanya's apartment a few days later, looking tired but calmer than I'd seen her in months. She told me she knew she should probably feel worse about her mom going to prison, but mostly she just felt relieved. The chaos was finally over and she could focus on building a normal life without waiting for the next crisis or scheme. Bailey said she'd been having nightmares about getting arrested herself for the money her mom put in her account, even though Ryan assured her she wouldn't face charges since she didn't know about the fraud. Now that Diane was sentenced and everything was settled, Bailey could actually sleep through the night without waking up in a panic. She asked if it was wrong that she felt this way, and I told her it was completely normal to feel relieved when someone who caused constant stress was finally removed from her life. I reminded her that loving her mom and recognizing her mom's toxic behavior could both be true at the same time. Bailey nodded and said her therapist told her the same thing, that she didn't have to choose between caring about her mom and protecting herself. Justin apparently felt similar, telling Bailey he was done trying to fix their mom's problems or make excuses for her behavior. He was focusing on work and building his own life separate from the mess Diane created. I threw myself into running the construction company, discovering I actually enjoyed the challenge once I got past the initial learning curve. Dean taught me how to read the political dynamics of client relationships, explaining which customers needed constant updates and which ones preferred minimal contact. I started bringing my own ideas about using reclaimed materials and energy-efficient building techniques, finding ways to modernize the business while keeping my dad's commitment to quality craftsmanship. The crew responded well to having clear leadership again after months of confusion under Diane's brother's mismanagement. I held weekly meetings where everyone could raise concerns or suggest improvements, something my dad used to do that had stopped when Diane took over. Dean became my unofficial mentor, pulling me aside to explain the unwritten rules of dealing with suppliers and managing crew personalities. He showed me which battles were worth fighting and which ones to let go, teaching me the relationship aspects of construction that you can't learn from blueprints or building codes. I found myself staying late at the office reviewing project plans, then coming in early to walk job sites before the crews arrived. The work was exhausting, but it felt right, like I was finally doing what my dad prepared me for all those years working summers on his projects. Some nights I'd sit at his old desk and read through his project notes, seeing how he solved problems and handled difficult clients, feeling like he was still teaching me even though he was gone. The custom home project for Mr. Anderson became my obsession for the next 4 months, checking every detail multiple times to make sure nothing went wrong. But we finished the framing 2 weeks ahead of schedule because the crew worked extra hours, everyone wanting to prove we could deliver quality work again. The electrical and plumbing inspections passed on the first try, which hadn't happened on any project during Diane's brother's management. Mr. Anderson stopped by the site regularly to check progress, and each time he seemed more impressed with how things were going. We brought the project in $3,000 under budget by negotiating better prices with suppliers and reducing waste through careful planning. When we handed over the keys, Mr. Anderson walked through the finished house with his daughter, both of them smiling at the craftsmanship and attention to detail. He pulled me aside before leaving and said the house exceeded his expectations, that he could see my dad's influence in the quality, but also my own creative touches in the design. He told me he'd already recommended us to 2 of his friends who were planning construction projects, saying he trusted me to deliver the same level of integrity and skill my dad was known for. The phone started ringing more often after that, new clients calling to ask about our services and mentioning Mr. Anderson's referral. I realized we were going to be okay financially after months of uncertainty about whether the company could survive. Dean gathered the crew after work one Friday and told them they'd done excellent work on the Anderson project, that we were building our reputation back one quality job at a time. Everyone seemed proud and relieved, knowing their jobs were secure and the company had a future again. I called Justin and asked if he wanted to work for the construction company, figuring he deserved a chance to build something real after watching his mom destroy things. He seemed surprised by the offer, asking if I was serious about hiring him despite everything that happened. I told him what his mom did wasn't his fault, and he'd actually been helpful during the whole investigation, even if he didn't realize it at the time. Justin started the following Monday doing basic labor, hauling materials and cleaning up job sites. The crew was skeptical at first, remembering he was Diane's son, but Dean vouched for him and said everyone deserved a fair shot. Justin worked hard without complaining, showing up early and staying late to prove himself. He asked questions about techniques and tools, genuinely wanting to learn the trade rather than just collecting a paycheck. After a few weeks, the crew started accepting him, teaching him proper ways to measure and cut materials, letting him help with more skilled tasks. Dean told me Justin had good instincts for the work and just needed experience, that he could become a solid carpenter if he stuck with it. I watched Justin loading lumber one afternoon, his shirt soaked with sweat, and thought about how different his life might have been if Diane had focused on teaching her kids honest work, instead of schemes and shortcuts. He was building something legitimate now, creating value instead of taking it from others. It felt good to give him that opportunity, knowing my dad would have approved of helping someone who wanted to learn and was willing to work for it. Bailey finished her first semester of community college with a 3.7 grade average, calling me excited to share her grades. She said she was thinking about studying business management, so she could maybe help run the construction company someday, combining what she learned in the school with real-world experience. I felt genuinely touched that she wanted to be part of continuing my dad's legacy, that she saw the company as something worth building rather than just an asset to liquidate. I told her there would always be a place for her if that's what she wanted, but she should also feel free to pursue whatever path made her happy. Bailey said working at the coffee shop and going to the school made her feel independent and capable, like she was proving she could succeed without relying on schemes or manipulation. Her boss at the coffee shop apparently praised her work ethic and offered her more hours, but Bailey wanted to keep her schedule flexible for classes. She'd moved from the tiny studio into a slightly bigger one-bedroom apartment, decorating it with furniture from thrift stores and making it feel like her own space. When she was invited me over to see it, I noticed she'd hung up photos of her, Justin, and me from recent months, but none of her mom. She caught me looking and said she wasn't ready to display pictures of Diane yet, maybe not ever. I understood that completely, knowing Bailey needed to build her own identity, separate from her mom's toxic influence. Tanya helped me interview property managers to handle renting out part of the family home, since the house was way too big for just me to live in alone. We found someone who specialized in managing multi-unit properties and understood how to screen tenants carefully. I decided to convert the upstairs into a separate apartment with its own entrance, keeping the main floor and my dad's workshop for myself. The rental income would cover property taxes and maintenance costs, making the house financially sustainable instead of a constant drain. Having other people living upstairs also made the house feel less empty and sad than it would have been with me rattling around in all that space by myself. The first tenants were a young couple who both worked as teachers, quiet and responsible people who respected the property. They told me they loved the craftsmanship in the house, noticing details my dad built into the design that most people missed. It felt good knowing the house my dad designed was appreciated and lived in rather than demolished for condos like Diane planned. I kept his workshop exactly how he left it, with his tools organized on pegboards and his workbench still covered in sawdust from his last project. Sometimes I'd go down there after work and just sit, surrounded by his tools and the smell of wood, feeling close to him in a way I couldn't anywhere else. I drove to the cemetery on a Saturday morning when I knew it would be quiet, parking near the oak tree that shaded my dad's grave. The headstone was simple granite with his name and the years he lived, nothing fancy because he never liked showing off. I sat down on the grass next to the marker and started talking like I always did when I visited, telling him about how the construction company just landed 3 new contracts and how the crew was working harder than ever. Dean had the guys running tight schedules and the quality was back to what it used to be when my dad was alive, with clients calling to say they were impressed with the craftsmanship. I told him Justin was doing good work on the crew, learning the trade properly instead of just coasting on handouts like Diane taught him. Bailey was getting straight A's at community college and seemed genuinely happy for the first time since I'd known her, free from her mom's constant manipulation and schemes. I thanked him for teaching me everything about construction and business, for showing me how to read blueprints and manage workers and deal with difficult clients. Those skills saved me when I had to fight for his legacy, giving me the knowledge I needed to take back what Diane stole. But I also told him I wished he'd been more careful about who he married, that he'd protected himself better with proper legal documents that couldn't be forged. I understood he was lonely after my mom died and wanted companionship, but Diane saw him as a target from day one, and he missed all the warning signs. I sat there for another 20 minutes just being quiet, watching leaves fall from the oak tree, and thinking about how different things would be if he was still alive. Ryan called me into his office downtown 3 days later to finalize the estate paperwork, spreading documents across his desk that needed my signature. He walked me through each form, explaining how all the assets were now properly transferred to my name with clear title and no remaining claims from Diane. The house deed, the construction company ownership papers, the investment accounts, everything was legally mine with documentation that couldn't be challenged. Ryan had also prepared a payment schedule for the restitution Diane owed, showing how much she'd pay each month from whatever prison job she got, and how long it would take to recover the full amount she stole. He said the criminal restitution was separate from the civil judgment, so I'd eventually get back most of what she took, even though it would take years. Ryan leaned back in his chair and told me this was one of the clearest fraud cases he'd ever handled, with evidence so solid that Diane's lawyers couldn't argue against any of it. He seemed genuinely pleased that the system actually worked the way it was supposed to for once, delivering real justice instead of letting someone rich or connected get away with crimes. I signed the final documents, and Ryan made copies for my records, then shook my hand and said I should be proud of how I fought for what was right. Walking out of his office with the paperwork folder under my arm felt like closing a chapter, knowing the legal battle was finally over and everything was settled. The detective who investigated Diane's criminal case showed up at the construction company office the following week, catching me while I was reviewing invoices at my desk. He knocked on the doorframe and asked if he could come in, then sat down across from me with a tired expression. He told me Diane was having a rough time adjusting to prison life, getting written up multiple times for refusing to follow rules and arguing with guards about everything. She apparently thought the rules shouldn't apply to her and kept demanding special treatment, which wasn't going over well with staff or other inmates. The detective said some people never learn from their mistakes, just keep making the same bad choices over and over expecting different results. But at least she couldn't hurt anyone else for the next 2 years, couldn't forge documents or manipulate vulnerable people or steal from anyone. He asked how I was doing with everything, and I told him the company was doing better, that we were rebuilding what Diane's brother destroyed. He seemed satisfied with that answer and said he was glad to see one of his cases actually have a positive outcome, since usually he just saw the damage criminals caused without seeing victims recover. After he left, I sat there thinking about Diane in prison, wondering if she felt any genuine remorse, or if she just felt sorry for herself for getting caught. I met with a financial advisor 2 weeks later to discuss setting up a scholarship fund in my dad's name, using $20,000 from the recovered assets. The advisor helped me structure it as a small annual scholarship for students studying construction trades at the local community college, covering tuition and books for one student each year. The application process would require an essay about why they wanted to learn construction and what quality craftsmanship meant to them, plus letters from teachers about their work ethic. I wanted students who actually cared about the trade, not just looking for easy money or a backup plan. The scholarship fund felt like a good way to honor my dad's commitment to teaching young people valuable skills, passing on the knowledge he'd shared with me to someone else who needed it. The advisor said the fund was set up properly with clear guidelines and would continue indefinitely as long as I kept contributing to it. I left his office feeling good about creating something positive from all the money Diane stole, turning her theft into an opportunity for someone who deserved help. Justin stopped by the construction site where I was checking on a foundation pour, pulling me aside during the crew's lunch break. He looked nervous as he told me he'd been talking to a therapist about his mom and everything that happened, trying to work through his complicated feelings about her being in prison. The therapist was helping him understand that he could love his mom while also recognizing she did terrible things, that those two feelings didn't cancel each other out. Justin said he wasn't responsible for fixing his mom or excusing her behavior, that she made her own choices and had to face the consequences. He seemed lighter somehow, like talking about it was helping him let go of guilt he'd been carrying. I told him I was proud of him for getting help and working through it instead of just pretending everything was fine. Justin said the therapist also helped him see how his mom manipulated him and Bailey their whole lives, always making them feel responsible for her happiness and using guilt to control them. Now he was learning to set boundaries and make decisions based on what he actually wanted, instead of what would please his mom. We talked for a few more minutes before the crew came back from lunch, and I felt grateful that Justin was building a healthier life for himself. Bailey brought her new boyfriend to the construction company office on a Friday afternoon, introducing him as Noah from her business management class. He was a quiet guy with glasses who shook my hand firmly and asked intelligent questions about how the company operated. Bailey seemed genuinely happy standing next to him, smiling more than I'd seen in months. After Noah excused himself to take a phone call, Bailey told me she was learning what healthy relationships looked like after growing up watching her mom manipulate people and use them. Noah treated her with respect, supported her goals, and didn't try to control her or make her feel guilty for having her own opinions. She said it was weird at first because she kept waiting for him to turn mean or demanding, but he just stayed consistently kind and honest. I told her I was proud of how much she'd grown and how she was breaking the patterns she learned from Diane. Bailey hugged me and said having me in her life showed her what real family support looked like, that I helped her and Justin without expecting anything back or using it against them later. Noah came back and they left together, and I watched them walk to his car thinking about how Bailey deserved someone who treated her right. The construction company threw a celebration party at a local restaurant after we closed out our best quarter in 3 years, with Dean organizing everything and inviting the whole crew. Everyone showed up in clean clothes instead of work gear, filling 2 long tables and ordering food and drinks. Dean stood up with a beer and made a toast, telling everyone that my dad would be proud of how we turned the company around from the mess Diane's brother created. He talked about the full project schedule we had booked and the waiting list of potential clients who wanted to work with us, proof that our reputation for quality was coming back strong. The crew raised their glasses to toast my dad's memory and the future of the company he built, and I felt emotional seeing how much they cared about preserving his legacy. We spent the next few hours eating and talking, with guys telling stories about working with my dad and the lessons he taught them about craftsmanship. Several crew members came up to tell me privately that they were glad I was running things now, that they trusted me to keep the company on track. Driving home that night, I felt grateful for the team my dad built, people who actually cared about doing good work instead of just collecting paychecks. I sat in my dad's old office at the construction company on a quiet Tuesday morning, reviewing plans for next quarter's projects spread across his wooden desk. The office still smelled like sawdust and coffee, exactly how he kept it, and I'd hung his favorite blueprints on the walls. Looking at the project schedule and the healthy bank balance and the stack of new client inquiries, I realized I was finally at peace with everything that happened. I got justice for my dad by proving Diane forged the will and stole his estate, saved his legacy by taking back the company in-house, and helped Justin and Bailey escape their mom's toxic patterns. The fight was brutal and exhausting, draining me emotionally and financially for months while I gathered evidence and built the legal case. But I won back everything that mattered, and now I was building something even better than just recovering what was stolen. The company was thriving with a reputation for quality work. Justin and Bailey were becoming healthier people, and I was using my dad's skills to create opportunities for others through the scholarship fund. Life was good now in ways I couldn't have imagined during those dark months after my dad died, and Diane evicted me. I knew my dad would be proud of how I fought for what was right instead of just accepting the injustice, how I used everything he taught me to protect his life's work. Sitting in his chair looking at the plans for our next custom home project, I felt his presence in the office and knew he was watching over the company we both loved.